Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is day 4 of our transparent cabinet meeting. I said last time, fictures are only the roles and the offices, and the resignation of the former government is only fictures, but the facts and the data are all true. What's possibly going on if there is no basis for the precautions, but the precautions are pushed by people who should know better? Professor 𝗏𝗏𝗺𝗃𝗍 gave us an explanation on this, that possibly the so-called Great Reset will play a role here, and this is something of individual states moving away from national states to a global government. This can be easily done by creating panic, which is exactly what we're seeing is going on, for the population to think that their regions and their national governments cannot cope with that, and thinks that they see that a global government, for example, as the UN, is the better solution. This cannot be agreeable in democratic ways, so we saw that a move away from national states should not be given up for a global government. Rather, the work should be taken away from the global government and assigned to the regions for customized local and regional supply systems, public services.
The big question is, what methods are the people who have tried to instill fear in us? What tools did they use, and are they still using in order to make us, or to keep us in this mode, in this panic mode?
I can describe, if you wish, so how the panic and how the anxiety was reorganized according to the Corona narrative. And the first and most important condition is that there has to be a large number of people in a society who feel socially isolated. A large percentage of people in a society who feel socially isolated, who feel socially isolated, who feel without real and good social bonds and social connections to other people. That's the first and most central condition that has to be met for mass formation to emerge. But the second one is that there has to be a lack of meaning making, a lack of sense making in life. People have to feel that their lives are meaningless or senseless. The third condition is that there has to be a lot of what we call as psychologists, free-floating anxiety. So anxiety that is not connected to a representation and that as such cannot be controlled mentally, that cannot be mentally controlled. But free-floating anxiety is the most painful psychological experience a human being can have. It's extremely painful. Free-floating anxiety constantly tends to turn into a panic attack. And if you have ever seen a clinical panic attack, then you know what this means to a human being. So it constantly tends to turn into a clinical panic attack. And that's what people absolutely try to avoid. And of these 4 conditions, the first one is the most central one. The most central one is the lack of social bond. When there is a lack of social bond, people experience their lives as meaningless. They experience a lot of free-floating anxiety, and they experience a lot of frustration and aggression. In a small country with 11 million inhabitants, such as Belgium, the population used 300 million doses of antidepressants. So, and there was an epidemic of burnouts at the same time, and also an epidemic of what is sometimes called bullshit jobs, and jobs in which are experienced as completely meaningless by the people who do them. Under such conditions, a society is very sensitive. A society is very sensitive to narratives that indicate an object of anxiety and at the same time provide a strategy to deal with this object of anxiety. And the consequence was that there was an enormous willingness among the population. In particular, if these narratives are presented through the mainstream media, to participate in this strategy, the lockdowns, social distancing, and other measures that were taken to deal with the object of anxiety. Two things that are absolutely fundamental from a psychological perspective for the human being. A human being without social bond and without a sense of meaning making does not feel a human being at all. It has the feeling that it disappears, that it fades as a human subject. Social isolation, to the opposite, to the situation in which the population experiences a highly strong social bond, a high level of solidarity, you could say, be it of a special kind. And that process leads up to a kind of strong mental intoxication, which narrows down the field of attention and focuses it until it contains only that aspect of reality. Once you understand that, you understand why the Corona narrative can be utterly absurd and blatantly wrong, but people will still continue to follow it and to go along with it. And that's why, in the end, the ultimate justification for following the measures is not the scientific proof, is the fact that you have to do it out of solidarity, out of civic sense. And then in a state of hypnosis, you can take away everything of a population. You can take away their well-being, their financial well-being, even their physical integrity, their physical health. They stop noticing the damage caused by the mass formation itself. Old people have to die without seeing their family, and so on and so on. It's a system, says Hannah Arendt, which starts from one starting point, and it seems as if all the rest, no matter how unethical it is, all the next steps are unavoidable. And we have to do it. If we want to contain the virus, we have to do X, Y, and so on, without seeing how much damage the strategy itself caused. And that's what is typical for totalitarianism. Once the ideological paradise is created and realized, it will be a paradise for everyone.
Ideology is a means to escape away from one's own experience, one's own feelings. That's the threat, and this is why we intellectualize it and take an ideology, and that blinds off the disaster that is inside and makes us think it is an external threat, terrorist, a virus, whatever. And that, of course, gives us great opportunity to fight the enemy in the outside. And that leads to the fanatism of traumatized people and make them think that they can fight a disaster on the outside instead of looking at the internal terror that they are subject to, which they don't want to face because it is too painful and too big. They try to find something at the outside and be the savior there to end a disaster. And for me, that is the bridge between the trauma concept and the totalitarianism concept.
Mm-hmm. And that is the big difference with classical dictatorships. In classical dictatorships, there is no mass formation. There is just a small group of people who have so much power in society that they can impose their will and their social contract to the society. And then at a certain time, there is a totalitarian regime which uses this narrative to control the population. What we see now, and the narrative that leads to the mass formation in itself solves the problem for a certain time, but it's a very destructive solution, which will lead to the massive destruction of humanity.
What kind of people do this? Because we're not talking about an accident. We're talking about a systematic agenda being rolled out.
You know, for instance, the concept of trauma is highly complicated in psychology. In a certain sense, everybody is traumatized, and we all have to deal with every human being has to deal with anxiety and with uncertainty and so on, and we can do it in numerous ways. I think they are so convinced of this ideology, and they are so convinced of the necessity to reorganize a society according to this ideology, that they transgress all, in the end, transgress all ethical principles.
There's a colleague in Germany, Mr. Fuchs, who wrote a book, Childhood is Political, with the subtitle Wars, Terrorism as Consequences of Destructive Childhood Experiences. And he analyzed the childhood experiences of many leaders over the centuries, of kings and others, determining how traumatizing the childhood of these people were, well-known figures in society and history. For instance, the Chinese Minister President Xi Jinping was a child of a family who had a share in power, who was very influential, and when the revolution came around, he was put into a labor camp. Bill Clinton is another example. He had an alcoholic as a father. Donald Trump, since he was 1 year old, he had a very ill mother and a father who was extremely violent. So you can show with many examples how these people, who then moved on to become very powerful, had extreme experiences of exclusion, violence, of lack of love, fleeing into certain mental ideologies, into actionism. So they become very tunnel vision people who only think of their own objectives.
It makes perfect sense to me. It makes perfect sense to me to look into people's early biography, in particular into their childhoods, in order to understand why maybe they're doing what they're doing.
It's not my field of expertise, but that will probably be true. There will be people who cultivated this anxiety and this social isolation in an intentional way. And so, at least if you look at the historical facts, the well-known historical facts on totalitarian regimes, then we see that in some of the totalitarian regimes, the social isolation emerged spontaneously without someone provoking it intentionally, and in other totalitarian states, it was created artificially. It could be that it is now, maybe it is a mixture between the two, I don't know, I'm not sure, but I think in the end, I think for me it is really important also to see that we all have a certain responsibility in this. And if you look at the historical process through which the social isolation automatically, as a consequence of the progressive industrialization, for instance, of the world. And as soon as people started working in the industry, it's hard to describe it in a few minutes in detail, but you could notice that the social structures and the social bonds deteriorated, and in particular, for instance, also the connection with nature.
Is there like a, when judging from like maybe previous totalitarian systems or like narratives, is there like a certain percentage? And how could these, if there's people that are in between or have not bought into the narrative completely, how do you think we can reach them as the new government, maybe also through information that we can maybe give out to people?
So when a phenomenon of mass formation starts, then you have one group who is really believing in the narrative that leads to the mass formation. That's a group of about 35% usually. Then there is a group of about the equal size that does not believe in the narrative, but that does go along with it because it doesn't want to go against this large group of 35% of people who fanatically believe in the narrative. So these people don't believe in it, or not entirely, but they go along with the narrative. And then there is another group, usually also about 30%, or that depends a little bit, there can be a little bit less, a little bit more, who does not believe in the narrative and who also speaks out, who says like there is something wrong with this narrative, and so on. If it is very dangerous to speak out, we can end up in a situation where 0% of the population dares to raise another voice in the public space and speaks out. And that is the point where the totalitarian system goes completely absurd and starts to devour its own children, meaning that from that moment on, everybody becomes a victim of the system. The people who went along with it equally well as the people who went against it. For instance, Stalin liquidated 50% of the people of his own communist party, even if they didn't do anything against the party or against the ideology. So that shows us what we can expect, and that shows us it is as cruel for the people who support it as for the people who go against it. So what can we do? Well, from a psychological point of view, there are several things that you can do. First thing is continue to speak out, because if you stop to speak out, you won't escape the totalitarian system. So I think we have to continue to speak out with as large group of people as possible. That's the first thing. The second thing is, if you want to have an impact on the masses, then you have to, you might consider to show them, as I just did now actually, with historical examples, for instance, what the risks and the suffering is that is caused by a totalitarian system. And because in that way, you create a new object of anxiety. That means you do not create it, you connect the anxiety from the initial object of anxiety, which is the virus in this situation, to the new object of anxiety, which is a real object of anxiety, meaning the risks, the danger of a totalitarian state. And then very quickly, after you presented this new object of anxiety, very quickly, you have to offer a strategy to deal with it. In that way, you also make sure that people who connect their anxiety to the new object of anxiety have a way to mentally deal with it and to have a mental control, have a perspective, and also a new way to give meaning to their lives. The danger is not the biological virus. The danger is the social dynamics, at least in my interpretation. I could be wrong, of course, and but that's what I believe now, and I think it's my ethical and moral duty to say what I believe now. I think we should avoid telling the population that we have the solution, because we don't. The solution is in everybody, and we have to work together to create a new awareness and a new consciousness as a human being of what we are doing here in this life. A much more fruitful strategy, I think, than the strategy which pretends that all the danger in the world is suddenly situated in a virus.
It's become clear that the coronavirus is not the problem, but actually that there's much more issues connected with the vaccination, the maybe vaccination damages crisis that we might be facing, also like, supply problems, the deterioration of the social bonds that we can see now in the aftermath of the corona crisis. And actually also if the old government had not resigned, I think there would have been like a very strong drive into going, moving forward into like some sort of intense totalitarian system, like with China, maybe China-like surveillance constellation, and like maybe like a health like a totalitarian technocratic health constellation.
Or let's do our best to see the other people, the people who we experience as our opponents in this situation, as human beings, because I think they are. But indeed, that does not mean that they are not responsible for the possible transgressions of laws and ethical principles they committed. I agree completely with that. We need principles, and we need punishment if someone transgresses the principles.
So I think that's really important, that we show people that there are these issues ahead of us, unless we really start to take care of them. And then I think after we've dealt with these immediate threats, or like on the way while we're dealing with these immediate threats, I think it's utterly important of what you just said, that we must be, that we need to start thinking about what it is to be a human being, and what's the beauty of it, and how we can have much more of that beauty in our daily life.
Yes, indeed. So I think what we have to try to offer, or we have to present an analysis in the public space, showing that the true problem is not a virus or the biological threat of a virus, but the true problem that led to the corona crisis was the pre-existing psychological discontent, the lack of social bond, and the lack of meaning making, and all the anxiety that existed before the Corona crisis. So the real question we have to ask ourselves is, what brought us in a situation in which people were not connected to each other, lacked an experience of meaning in life, and experienced a lot of free-floating attention? And that's the question we really have to ask. How was it possible that a major part of the population was so unhappy that they had to be treated with antidepressants day in, day out, that they experienced their jobs as utterly meaningless, that they experienced burnouts, and so on.
And as long as we have a system, including the financial system, based on competition, extremely on competition, a political system that has a hierarchical position, with the top position being able to decide everything, as we see now, then these traumatized people are pulled and attracted by that kind of system. And this is what the basis, the grassroots party tries to do. Is we need grassroots democracy, we need limitations of power, so that these hierarchies at the top of which one person makes the decisions, with all its history, affects the whole society. So here the individual part, the individual family history needs to be seen in context with the society, and this social context is extremely pointed towards competition, and the states amongst each other are also in extreme competition. So on the government side, 192 states on the world, it's not that they are in peaceful cooperation, but they are in a very strong competition to each other. And that also needs to be seen, and that needs to be addressed if we want to create a better world in the future, and that will allow us to create something that people don't get into this strong offendership.
And what we have to offer, what we have to initiate in society, is a collective brainstorm about the true origins of the problems that lead to mass formation. Namely, why are we so socially disconnected? Why do we experience this lack of sense-making? And that will imply a fundamental questioning of our mechanistic view on man and the world. And I think that at that point, the crisis shows itself to be much more crisis at the level of the mind, even a spiritual crisis, than a biological crisis. And that's, I think, where we can experience this crisis as really meaningful. It forces us to ask ourselves what the true meaning of our life is, and what really human view on the world is. And I think the answer to the question is already provided by the great scientists of the 20th century, for instance. All of them warned us that we cannot understand the world in a purely rational way, that we have to connect with the world, that the mind and our consciousness is not purely a consequence of the biochemical interactions in our brain, not at all. What we have to do is we have to show that this scientific ideology, which tries to convince us that as a human being we are purely biological machines, in the end is not scientific at all.
Well, we all agree in the meantime that there is a spiritual level to everything that we're experiencing right now.
The current narrative is that the human being is the human being's wolf. People only want to maximize their profit. And this image of people is wrong. It cannot be scientifically verified. People arrive out of cooperative efforts. People are full of love and do want to be loved. People are not intrinsically interested in killing other people for any sort of benefit of their own. So we all start with peace and in a cooperative way and with love, and we can refer back to this, and we can be taken back there if we lost our way. This is possible. It is possible for every individual, as I know from my many years of experience as a trauma therapist. Every person can solve their psychological problems. Nobody...
Of course. And every society can do it.
You can, of course, try to run away and become an addict of some drugs. You can become a work addict or whatever, but you don't have to. Our essence is to be peaceful and cooperative, and you can get back there. But if we allow our childhood traumas to take us away from this path, and oftentimes we're not aware of these childhood traumas, we still can find healing.
I would like to ask you to correct me on this. The first thing is, in order to deal with what we're dealing with, we have to continue to speak out, because once we shut up, that's the end of it, and that means that a victory for totalitarianism. The second thing is that we have to show the risks. In this particular context, the risks of totalitarianism, which means in the end, the revolution eats its own children, so to speak. Mm-hmm. That has to be made perfectly clear to those who believe that they're doing the right thing. This is what awaits them. And then the third aspect is we have to come up with a new strategy. Maybe not with a complete new strategy, but we have to start a probably public discussion and connect with pretty much everyone in order to kind of feel, is this correct, to feel ourselves into a new society?
Yeah, I completely agree.
Okay,
yes.
Good. Mm. It's, as you initially said, it's nonsense. It's complete nonsense. It's the only thing that people believe. The only reason people believe it is because it gives them something to cling to for their otherwise free-floating anxiety. But it is utter nonsense, as we have learned from the experts whom we listen to. So how do we get out of this? By exposing this as nonsense?
So the rational argumentation, we have to offer it, but only in a second step. If you try it in a first step, you will even make it worse, because people will get irritated and angry with you because you try to take their object of anxiety away without offering them a new object. And indeed, trying to take the representation, the object of anxiety away of people is pushing them back in the state of free-floating anxiety and panic. It's the wrong. It's the wrong approach.
We have to be authentic. We have to be real. But I think in order to transport this, we have to use emotions. Or is that wrong?
No, I agree. I completely agree. I think what you call the emotional approach, I don't know if I would call it like that. I would call it more resonance. You have to resonate with people. You have to focus your attention wider, and that you have to see that there is collateral damage as well. And indeed, we can only do that, I think, by connecting to the people. Indeed, yeah, I agree. Yes.
About shifting their focus away from this is how dangerous the virus is to this is what the measures do to the health and security and well-being of the people. Look at what's going on here. Look at how people have to die in isolation. I mean, this would mean that we're challenging them to reconnect to real feelings, to empathy, because as you pointed out earlier, they haven't lost this, it's just that it's being blocked. And I think the only way to get through is by showing them these emotional pictures, by, basically by appealing to their being humans.
Yes. I think it too, and I think for me it is not unethical to show people that there are other objects of anxiety as well. And it's not unethical, I think, because It's true. If they don't watch out, they will end up in a situation in which they are devoured by the system they support now. So it's not unethical to show that. It's because it would only be unethical if you used that anxiety for your own profit or for having power over them or something. But if you use it just to take the focus away of the one object of attention, focus it to something else, and then show them immediately, like, look. So that new object of anxiety, this totalitarian state, for instance, we can avoid it by connecting to each other, by talking to each other, and so on. With just maybe you were unhappy before the crisis, and in one way or another, the lockdown freed you up from this unhappy situation or that unhappy job. But you can become free in another way as well. You don't have to accept the social credit system.
It cannot be unethical to substitute a false narrative with a true narrative. That cannot be unethical.
Professor Wallach, maybe you want to share your expertise, your findings?
No, I think it was a very lucid summary that we've heard here, and there's nothing to add. I think we need this openness vis-à-vis a new narrative and this restriction of the materialist, transhumanist narrative. We need to focus on this because it has taken us where we are. And we need to look for new options. I think this would involve the churches who tragically failed here, I think, who might reposition themselves, and maybe there are other ways of developing these new narratives concerning the meaning, the dignity, the objective of human life.
Das Ziel menschlichen Lebens ausmacht, zu gewinnen.